outside help rather than turning to God. And the prophet Hananiah comes to him and says, God's not happy with you. The eyes of the Lord roam throughout the earth so that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. That's whose God's favorite is, the one whose heart is completely his. Now that's a little more complicated than we might think, and we're going to see how that plays out. Last week, though, we saw Matthew and Mark's account of Jesus' visit to Nazareth. And it started out real well. The hearers were impressed. They were excited, well-disposed. Their hometown boy was there. 3 different Gospels give 3 different things they said. Is this Jesus the carpenter? Another said, is this Mary's son? Luke 4, is this Joseph's son? They can't believe the hometown boy is there. He's now quite the celebrity, has healed a lot of people. They're excited. He's going to be in the synagogue, speak with them a few days. But from there it went south. The Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 4, tells us a lot more about what transpired that day and what happened. You know, when Jesus spoke, all the accounts agree that they were amazed by what he said. How did he sound? How did Jesus speak? We get a clue just reading the Gospels. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't intellectual. He didn't try to make you cry with moving stories. He didn't shout and get all emotional. He didn't bully or threaten. But he spoke directly. He spoke to the heart. And it's interesting that he was compared to Elijah because he was in the tradition of the so-called speaking prophets, Elijah and Elisha, the 2 main speaking prophets, as compared to Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, those prophets. Speech is more immediate than writing. When you speak to somebody, it's person to person, isn't it? Heart to heart. What happens the minute you put things into writing? Well, then the interpretation game can begin. What does this word mean? And this, and we get on and on. And if you're not careful, the written words of God can turn into a puzzle you try to solve. But Jesus spoke, and his spoken words are just face to face and demand a response. And that's where he would. When he spoke to them, they didn't have any experts there to parse exactly what this meant and that meant, and he was speaking to them. He speaks to us too. As we saw, Jesus only performed a few miracles among them. One of the accounts said that he did only a few miracles. One said that he could only do a few miracles. He could not do miracles because of their unbelief. Now that's sort of new. Our faith in faith, even our faith in God, it cannot do a thing. But our lack of faith in God can do something. It can limit God's willingness, even God's power in some way we don't understand, to do the miraculous. And that's what they were. Lack of faith can somehow limit what God does, and that's going to be one of the lessons here. But what shocked the people of Nazareth? That's going to be our focus today. And that question matters because we might be living in spiritual Nazareth today and not even realize it. So we need to carefully examine our own hearts. Let's turn to Matthew 4. And this is what Jesus read in the synagogue that day, starting in verse 18. It's a well-known passage. Isaiah 61 is how we know it. And he stands up before them and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." Well-known passage. By the way, if you like Bible trivia, here's a little bit of trivia. That phrase, recovery of sight to the blind, which is about 2/3 the way down, that phrase does not appear in the Hebrew Masoretic text, but it does appear in the Greek translation of the Hebrew, the Septuagint. And some people say, well, Jesus must have read from the Greek translation of Isaiah rather than from the Hebrew. Well, they usually read from the Hebrew, and it may be that when they knew he read that he read Isaiah 61, and they just copied from the Septuagint. There are a lot of answers to why that is there, but that's just trivia. The only impact that might have for us, what translation of the Bible do we use? Did Jesus use the Septuagint? Did he read from the Hebrew that day? I think both were okay. A lot of the New Testament quotations are from that Greek translation, the Septuagint, which did not always exactly conform to the Hebrew. God's message came through. And a lot of translations, I'm doing this study from the New American Standard because it's the closest word for word kind of correspondence, but it's not the most readable. If you get the NIV or the NLT, which is really good, I like it, and a number of other translations, the word comes through. And we need to think about the word as spoken. And if we get too big into this translation of this word and we start doing the exegesis game, then we lose sight of the message. We don't want to do that. What would they have thought when Jesus read these verses? Here's what the commentators pretty much agree on, most agree on. The Jews of Jesus' day would have assumed that this passage was addressed to the people of Israel. God had chosen them to be his special people. The promise of the Spirit, the good news of release and recovery and freedom in God's favor was one for them to share. But they knew, of course, that they couldn't do all of that themselves. They knew that a prophet was coming who would embody that power. So they believe that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, is maybe ultimately Israel, but immediately it's another prophet, like the prophet Isaiah. Just as Isaiah was inspired to speak, so in the future there will be another prophet who will speak, and he will speak what Isaiah spoke. All these blessings, good news to the poor, release to the captives, sight to the blind, freedom to those who are oppressed. They saw him as a prophet. And this message was initially real encouraging for them. What were they thinking? Maybe it's something like this. Boy, oh boy, he's about to do it. He might really be the prophet Isaiah was foretelling. He sounds good. He's going to do some miracles for us. This is going to be great. It's like the excitement at an old-fashioned healing service at a tent meeting or something. It's about to happen, and they're there with those expectations. Yes, yeah. So they're expecting the renewal of all things, and he's going to bring it. The Jubilee years. The prayers have gone up, the blessings are about to fall down, and it's going to be great. Can you believe this is Joseph's boy? Wow. It's all going to start over. He's going to do all those miracles, release for the captives, set free those who are oppressed. If he can do all the miracles we've heard about, if he does them here, this could be the beginning of the revolt against Rome. Maybe the Romans will bring tribute to us. All the nations will bring tribute to Israel rather than the Romans taking taxes from us. It's going to be great. Think of all the things he could do. Do you remember the crowd in John chapter 6? They were going to make Jesus a king by force. They said, this is the guy, he can do it. He just needs some encouragement, man. We got to prod him on to get busy with the revolution. A few verses further down, it says, he will bring the day of vengeance of our God. They just saw all the enemies of Israel overthrown, subject to them. Well, Jesus' response was nothing like what they expected. He said to them, "No doubt you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself. All the miracles that we heard were done in Capernaum. Do here in your hometown as well.'" What did that proverb mean? Probably something a lot like, "I'm from Missouri, you've got to show me." You know, if you're a prophet, you sound like one, you read that in a great way, show us. Give us some miracles, and we'll know, and we're behind you 100%. Wow. If you're a prophet, the proof's in the pudding, and you need to stir up a pudding for us. We need some big miracles here. And we're your hometown crowd. We're with you all the way. But he threw cold water on their pipe dreams of enrichment and entitlement and all those good things. But this kind of thinking appears too often in churches. God's going to work a miracle for you today. There's going to be a chicken in every pot. Believe it and you'll receive it. Name and claim your blessing. That's the spirit of Nazareth. I want my miracle. Give it to me. Expect to see it now. That was, as we're going to see, it's antithetical to what Jesus was teaching. He was teaching about faith, and they're focused on blessings. Two different categories of thought. They liked Jesus' words, but they heard them wrong. And this is where I'm going to step on my toes, maybe yours too. Did you ever hear a sermon or an exhortation and think, "That's good. I like that. I feel better for having heard it"? But you never really intended to do anything different because you heard it? You know, Jesus' promises and warnings can just run off our hearts like water off a duck's back, as the saying goes. You can be born again. And we think, well, that's a nice thought. People need to hear that. I always feel better when I hear positive messages like being born again. That response is going nowhere, right? Nowhere. Make it personal. Do you want to be born again now? I think positive messages are important, but I'm good for right now. I'm really not ready to make any changes. It's not a good time. And besides, you're asking a lot. How do I know I can trust you? You see, that's what happens when the message is not just a general message, but a pointed person-to-person, face-to-face message. And don't make a mistake. Satan will make trust hard. Jesus said, repent, that is, change your priorities, change your direction of life, and believe the good news. But what do you do to believe? You've got to shed that crust of comfort. I'm happy where I am. You've got to rip that crust off if you're going to really hear. You have to take off the armor plate of suspicion that we all put on over the years. We get suspicious. Oh, what's his angle here? It's risky to hear, to believe, and to respond. And they were happy to hear, but they were not willing to take the risks. And that's what he's going to challenge them on. Superficially, a positive reaction. They looked like they would be receptive. If I had been there that day and I read they were all just buzzing and humming with excitement, I thought, oh boy, I've got them. Now we're headed where we need to go. But Jesus comes back with a challenge. They wanted a political leader to lead a revolution. They wanted just some benefits for themselves, some healing. They weren't listening like they were supposed to listen. They were listeners like the ones that came to hear the prophet Ezekiel hundreds of years before. I think I have a slide for that. Yeah. In Ezekiel 33, he said of people in his day, this prophet, "And behold, you are to them like a love song by one who has a beautiful voice and plays well on an instrument. For they hear your words, but they do not put them into practice. Boy, that was a good sermon. Did you like that? That was just over the top this morning. You going to do anything about it? You know, the spirit expressed here in Ezekiel 33 leads to a terrible contract in a lot of churches. And here's how the contract goes, signed off by everyone present. If you'll talk pretty and offer blessings, we'll say awesome a lot. Then we can all go out for lunch. And who's playing ball this afternoon? You see, that's the way you do it. You uplift me, I praise you, and we just go on just like we've always done. It can even take a more twisted form, a kind of spiritual sadomasochism. I'll come to church. You can tell me how bad I'm doing. We can take the Lord's Supper and you can tell me how much physical pain Jesus Christ suffered, and I'll feel really bad. But it ends up the same way. I'll feel bad, I'll feel guilty, you got to beat me up, and we go out to eat. And we might say, boy, the preacher stepped on my toes this morning, and everybody's kind of embarrassed. Yeah, I know. And then we start talking about how our theology is better than somebody else's, or our lives are better than somebody else's. We start feeling good about ourselves again, and nothing changes. We've just had a lesson. Jesus tells them, I didn't come home expecting to be praised. I didn't come here to have you praise me. He says, no genuine prophet was ever accepted in his hometown. It's hard to hear a prophet from your hometown. You know too much, or you think you know too much. And it's not what you don't know that hurts you. It's what you think you know for sure. That just ain't so. And they thought they knew Jesus. Didn't have a clue, couldn't hear the message, hearing for the wrong things, and turned out disastrously. You know, the people of Nazareth saw Jesus as a prophet when he read the words of the prophet. And he cites two prophets. Like a good rabbi, gives two examples to make his point. Both of them are speaking prophets like him, men who spoke the word and not wrote out words to be interpreted. The first one of these was the story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath in Sidon. Here's what he says, a hard lesson. He said, I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. Sidon was a very pagan place. Jezebel, whom Elijah lived during her life and denounced her, Jezebel was the daughter of the king of Sidon. This was a very pagan, godless place. But God sent Elijah to a widow in Sidon and not to anybody in Israel. Well, if you're a citizen of Nazareth expecting the blessings to fall on Israel and especially on you, what? God sent his prophet outside of Israel? She was a foreigner. She's not one of the chosen people. She's outside the covenant. Why did God send the prophet to her? You remember the story, don't you? She has just a little bit of oil and a little bit of flour, just enough to make a couple of little hush puppies or something for her and her son to eat. And then, due to the famine, there's nothing to eat, no prospects of getting anything to eat. They'll just lie down in the corner of the house and wait for death. That's where they are. Nothing. Had nothing. And Elijah shows up. And he says, first, make a little cake for me. Ooh. If she had been from Nazareth, what would she have said? You want me to believe you're a prophet? You do a miracle first, and then I'll go all in. But look at what this woman did. She made a cake and a little oil and flour, cooked it up for him, and said, here it is. Now, talk about being from the show me state, needing evidence of belief. Her evidence of belief wasn't, wow, is this Joseph's son? This is a really great sermon. It was, I made a little cake out of my last food, and I'm giving it to this man. That's what biblical faith is. She risked everything. She took a chance. She put herself out there. And she got a tremendous miracle. As we all know, he made enough oil. She kept pouring oil into containers until she had enough she could sell oil and support the three of them until the famine was over. Tremendous miracle. But the miracle followed faith. Not, show me you're a prophet, and then I'll believe. She has a spirit of belief, spirit of faith. That's the spirit we need to have. It's the same spirit that Jesus saw in that Roman centurion. When the centurion says, I want you to heal my servant, just speak the word. You don't have to come. You don't have to touch him. Just say the word and he'll be healed. And Jesus said, I haven't seen this kind of faith in Israel. It's kind of sad. In Jesus' day, in Elijah's day, in our day, some of the greatest faith is felt outside the nation of Israel, outside the church, outside the covenant people of God. There's a thought to think about. The first example Jesus gives, God sent a prophet out of Israel, past all these other hungry widows, to a woman in Sidon because she had faith. She probably didn't even know she had faith. But when he arrived and made that request, she had faith. Then he tells another example. I had a little note here. Let's talk about what biblical faith is. A desire for good, compassion, a willingness to obey, even when it requires you to risk everything. She risked the life of her child that day, as well as her own life. That's biblical faith. If you remember the Indiana Jones movies, the one where they try to get the chalice that Jesus drank from, and they finally get up in this little cave, and you have to get across to the other side where all the different chalices were. How do you get across? Well, the little bridge doesn't appear until you step out and you go forward, and then the step appears. That's what she did. She stepped out, she put her weight falling down, and then the step appeared, and then the next step, and the next step. That's how biblical faith works. That's what God rewards, Jesus says. Not your official religious status. He's looking for faith. And we need to take this message to heart. God blesses unchurched people who have faith. And he'll do that before or instead of people of the covenant who may have a sense of entitlement but don't really have any belief. They say, well, I was baptized. I come to church regularly. I've checked the boxes. I've signed the contract. I'm good. No real belief. No risk. Just easy peasy. Belief in the real meaningful sense is not intellectual knowledge. It's not intellectual assent. But it's people who have a desire for goodness and they'll risk it all. Trust. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And that's not to say our theology and our religious practices don't matter. It's just to say that correct religion is no substitute for genuine faith. Now, faith should lead to good religion, right religion, but you can't substitute it, and that's the main point. What God wants is faith. What provokes him is smug entitlement that the people of Nazareth had that day that we have to be careful we don't have this day. The righteous shall live by faith. Responsive, risk-taking, longing for God. He didn't say the righteous will live by accurate knowledge. The righteous will live by perfect obedience. Do any of us have perfect knowledge or perfect obedience? But the righteous will live by faith. That's the message, I think, of Nazareth that day. Then he goes to another example, and let's look at that one quickly. Next he says, this is his second example. This is not of a prophet sent out of Israel. This is of a man coming into Israel. Naaman the prophet. We remember the story. Naaman is a general, and he is an enemy of Israel. He's inflicted a lot of damage. It would be like, I don't know, General Sherman coming to a preacher in Atlanta for prayer and healing. Or maybe a Hezbollah commander coming to Tel Aviv to see a rabbi. That was just amazing. You know, what in the world is going on there? He had leprosy. He had a little servant girl who had been captured and slave in his household. And she said, you know, if you're in Israel, there's a man there who can heal you. And so, make the story short, he ends up going to Israel. He had faith too. It was hard for him to get there in a way. He had a lot of pride to overcome. But think about what he did. He crossed the border into enemy territory. Right away, that's a risk. He asked an enemy for help. That's humiliating. That's saying, we're not your conquerors. We need you to help us. He dipped 7 times in a muddy river, and the whole thing just flew in the face of reason when he did that. His entourage of men was there. He had a whole entourage. They all saw this. What are they going to think? He'll look like a fool if he gets in that water and nothing happens. He'd look weak and desperate, contemptible. He's just about ready for assassination, isn't he? Look how pathetic Naaman is, going down there and jumping in that nasty water because this prophet said to. But he did it. He complained about it, got mad about it, but he did it. Sometimes we get mad about what God asks us to do. Just do it. He had the courage to believe, and he was healed. You know, Elijah refused money that day. He brought a treasure with him. Elijah said, don't want your money. You don't buy God's help. Everything God gives is a gift. You don't buy it. Gedaliah, his servant, snuck back around and told a lie and got some of the treasure. Then he was struck, and his family was struck with leprosy from that point on. But the end of the story is interesting. Let's look at this. Then Naaman said, please let your servant, that's himself, be given 2 mules' load of earth. For your servant will no longer offer a burnt offering, nor sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. He says, I believe in Jehovah God, the God that healed me. I believe. Just give me some 2 mules of earth. That's a pretty shaky understanding of theology, isn't it? He was still thinking gods were local, and Jehovah was the God of Israel, and their gods had precedence in their world. Bad theology, but the right desire. And then he asked for this bit of grace. Regarding this matter, may the Lord forgive your servant. When my master, the king, goes into the house of Rimmon, their god, to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow down in the house of Rimmon. When I bow down in the house of Rimmon, may the Lord please forgive your servant in this matter. He says, in essence, I've got to go to this pagan place of worship, and I've got to do pagan acts of obedience, but my heart is not there. Please forgive me. I've got to do something that's not commanded. And what does he say? Elisha says, Shalom, go in peace. okay, is what he says. He didn't say, you better send your guys back home and come join Israel. He didn't say you need to be circumcised. He didn't say any of those things. He said, you can go back home. Go in peace. What a lesson. That's not to say all those other things aren't important, but what a lesson there. I don't think it's a model for evangelism. There's more to that than you look at the gospel that Jesus preached, Acts 2 sermon, all those things. They matter, but that's not, you better get faith right first. If you don't have faith, the rest of it's nothing. And if you have faith, then you're in God's hands. And we don't need to pass judgment all over the place in all kind of ways that we want to pass judgment. God looks at the heart. So who are God's favorites? We don't have a special status with God just because we always attended church. That's a good thing. We don't have a special status with God. He doesn't love us because our parents were members or leaders or preachers or anything like that. We're not God's special favorite because we went to seminary or Bible college or had these classes. I heard an amazing woman who had memorized several of the letters of Paul, memorized it. Does God love her best because she had memorized those letters? That's impressive. That's good. But no, that's not what he's looking for. Paul said you can give your bodies to be burned. But if you have not love for God and love for others, you've wasted your time. He's looking for faith. All that matters is how receptive we are to the gospel, the good news, belief in God. The things we need to ask, are we demanding a sign, or do we see how remarkable Jesus is? Do we long for his coming into this world? Do we believe that he is the way to the Father? Even in our doubts, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, do we cry out, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief? Then you've got faith. And that is one of the most deeply faithful prayers you can pray. I believe, help my unbelief. Unbelief is a part of all of us, but that desire to believe will overwhelm that instinct of unbelief. The spirit of faith is what matters. Start with faith. You start with faith, you'll end up where you need to be. Just grab that golden cord. Don't let go of it and follow it. It will lead you where you need to go, but you start with faith. You don't start with obedience. You don't start with theology or groups or anything else. We had all better start with faith and go from there. If we don't, those other things will be impediments instead of helps. And all of those things is what we can call the spirit of Nazareth. We don't want that in our hearts, deaden them to what Christ was trying to bring to them that day. Okay, we'll stop with that, and next week we'll go next in Christ and Culture. We'll go to Jesus when he moved physically his house to Capernaum and things that happened there. It's a new set of dynamics, and we'll discuss that next week. Thanks.